Summary of A River Runs Through It by Norman Maclean. At the beginning of the story, Norman Maclean, the narrator, talks about what it was like to grow up in Missoula, Montana, as the son of a Scottish Presbyterian preacher who is very religious and loves God and fly fishing. Norman and his brother Paul read the Bible and go to church a lot of the time when they're not in school. But their dad also teaches them the very difficult art of fishing, where you have to learn how to read the river and try to understand what it says. Their family is very close and doesn't trust people from other families. Norman and Paul only fight once. When their mother tries to separate them, she trips and hurts herself, which teaches them a lesson: they will never fight again. Paul, on the other hand, still likes to fight. He has always been very stubborn, and he likes to bet on anything. As he gets older, he starts to gamble. Norman works for the U.S. Forest Service as a teen during the summer, while Paul is a lifeguard and has time in the nights to fish. Paul is now the better fisherman, and his main goal is to keep work from getting in the way of his fishing. He gets a job as a reporter for a newspaper in Helena, Montana's city. There is a lot of action in this short story in the summer of 1937. Paul lives in Helena, and Norman lives in Wolf Creek with his wife Jessie's family. Norman just heard from Florence, his mother-in-law, that Jessie's brother Neil is coming from the West Coast and would love to go fishing with Norman and Paul. The two meet outside of a bar, but it's not even noon yet. Nicole and Paul don't like Neil because they see him as a stranger and a failed Montanan. But they love Florence, so they agree to go fishing with Neil on the Elkhorn. The next morning, the boys go fishing together. On the way, Paul jokes with Norman about getting into a car accident, probably while drunk, and having to pay a fine. Norman isn't sure how seriously to take it. But Paul gets the upper hand again when they're fishing, because Norman likes the way he uses shadow casting. Paul goes out on the town while Norman stays with Paul for the night. In the middle of the night, Norman gets a call to come down to the jail. A man had sworn at the girl Paul was with, a part Native American woman Norman calls Emoniacita. This made Paul fight with the guy. Norman drives them home and then goes back to Wolf Creek to try to figure out how he can help Paul. A few days later, Neil gets on the train in Wolf Creek, Montana, wearing 2 sweaters and bringing a suitcase with his initials on it. This is not something that is normally seen there. Neil tries to sneak off to a bar as soon as he can. Norman goes with him because Jessie asked him to watch over her brother. They meet Long Bow, who often goes to the bar, and Old Rawhide, the town whore. Norm tells Neil he's going to go to bed early because Neil is slowly sidling up to Old Rawhide. Paul is at their door early the next morning to go fishing. Neil is still in bed because he stayed up late, which makes Florence a little ashamed. But Paul says Neil didn't go to bed at all. These 3 guys get into the truck with Florence, Jessie, and Ken, Jessie's other brother. They are going to the Elkhorn. Another time, Jessie tells Norman to keep an eye on Neil. But when they go downstream together, Neil says he'll stay at a certain bend and then falls asleep. As the day goes on, Norman quickly forgets about Neil and goes fishing with Paul. He finally gets the idea to go back and look for Neil as storm clouds start to form. He looks for him along the river while it's pouring rain, but he can't find him. When he and Paul get back to the truck, Neil is inside, safe and dry. The women are mad at Norman for leaving Neil behind. Norman knows that Jessie doesn't like him, so he tells him to take a break and go fishing with Paul for a few days. That's what Jessie says. Norman drives up to Helena, but when the brothers go to their summer house in the nearby river, they find that Neil and Old Rawhide have followed them. Neil says he wants to go fishing with the brothers right now. It's noon, too hot to fish, and Neil forgot his rod. Paul won't stand this carelessness any longer, so he makes them get in the car anyway. Neil and Old Rawhide have brought alcohol and are getting more and more drunk. Norman and Paul leave them, hide some beers in the cold river for later, and find their own places to fish. They fish for as long as they can until the heat gets too much to handle. The beers aren't there on their way back, though. The brothers are almost back to the car when they see 2 red, naked bodies lying on a riverbank. Old Rawhide and Neil have drunk all of their alcohol and beers and are fast asleep, with terrible sunburns starting to form. In quiet, Norman and Paul drive them back to town, drop off Old Rawhide, and go home. Paul then leaves Norman to deal with the women, who are Jessie, Florence, and Ken's wife Dorothy. On the spot, they put Neil to bed, and Norman and Jessie start to fight but quickly make up. The other women say over and over that they love Norman too. Norman feels forgiven, so he does what Jessie says and goes back to Helena to finish his fishing trip with Paul. Paul tells them to go to their parents' house and invite their dad. They do that, and their parents are happy to see them, especially Paul. But they get mad when Paul goes to the bars after dinner. He is still ready to fish before Norman or his father in the morning. They fish together in a few holes. At first, Norman does better than his brother, which makes him feel proud and happy, but Paul quickly gets back on top. Norman gives up after a while and sits down next to his father, who is reading the Bible. They both admire Paul's skill and talent as he tries to push himself to the limit. As Norman tells this story many years after the fact, he says that he often thinks about the fishing trip because it was the last time he would fish with Paul. Soon after, Paul was beaten to death and left in a ditch. Norman and his dad keep asking each other if there was anything they could have done, but they can't agree on what it is. The only thing they really get is that Paul was a great artist and fisherman. Even though Norman is old, he still loves fly fishing and enjoys the beauty and flow of the sport. But his past keeps coming back to haunt him.
About the author. Norman Maclean was born in the United States to a Presbyterian preacher and his wife who had come here from Nova Scotia. When Norman was a child, his family moved to Missoula, Montana. Maclean was too young to fight in World War I, so he worked in logging camps in a public forest. He first went to Dartmouth College and then to the University of Chicago, where he got his PhD in English and taught poems and Shakespeare. He married Jessie Burns in 1931, and the two of them had 2 children. In 1990, he died in Chicago.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.